Throughout history, countless stories of champions have painted a legendary image of the medieval period. But below this face of honor and beauty lies a darker reality, especially for women of the era. The lives of these women were far from the fairy tales we often hear about. From disturbing beauty standards to terrifying persecutions, the medieval age presented its challenges for the female population. What were some of the specific beauty standards imposed on women during the medieval period? Join us as we unravel the top 10 messed up things that women in the medieval age went through. Number 10. Footbinding. During the medieval period in China, footbinding wasn't merely a personal choice, but a deeply ingrained cultural practice that spread through every aspect of a woman's life. The process of footbinding was carefully carried out, often by experienced older women within the family or specialized binders in the community. These binders would tightly wrap the feet with long strips of cloth, gradually pulling them tighter over time to achieve the desired small size. From a young age, girls as young as 5 years old would have their feet tightly bound, causing their toes to break and fold under the sole in a painful process. This resulted in a drastic adjustment of the foot's natural shape, making it difficult for women to walk or stand for extended periods. As a consequence, their movement was severely restricted, limiting their opportunities in life mainly to domestic roles. The ideal foot size, known as the golden lotus, was about 3 inches in length. Achieving this size was a mark of beauty and social status, as it demonstrated a woman's obedience to cultural norms and her family's wealth to afford such careful care. However, this pursuit of beauty came at a great cost. Footbinding was not just a physical ordeal, it was also deeply twisted with notions of womanly qualities and virtue. A woman with bound feet was seen as graceful, delicate, and refined, traits highly prized in traditional Chinese society. On the contrary, women with natural, unbound feet were often looked down upon and considered rough and innocent. The consequences of footbinding extended beyond physical pain. It had profound psychological effects, as women personalized the belief that their worth lay solely in their appearance and ability to conform. This societal pressure fueled the continuation of footbinding for centuries, despite growing awareness of its damaging effects. Moreover, footbinding wasn't limited to the elite or upper classes. While it was more prevalent among the wealthy and noble families who could afford the luxury of bound feet, women from lower socioeconomic backgrounds also partook in this practice, though to a lesser extent. For them, footbinding represented a means of upward social mobility, a way to emulate the refined manners and status symbols of the upper class. Despite its long-standing tradition, footbinding eventually fell out of favor in the early 20th century due to increasing modernization and Western influence in China. Efforts by reformers and activists, coupled with changing societal attitudes towards women's rights, led to the gradual abandonment of footbinding by the mid-20th century. Number 9. Childbirth and pregnancy. Pregnancy and childbirth are big topics to cover. If you've ever been pregnant, you probably know it's not all rainbows and butterflies. It can be pretty tough. Some people might say they love every bit of it, even the part where you feel sick for months or can't get comfortable no matter what. And don't forget about those kicks to the ribs that wake you up at night. When you're pregnant, your body is busy growing a tiny human, so your immune system isn't at its strongest. That means you're more likely to catch colds and other displeas. Back in medieval times, people didn't know much about germs or how to stay clean. Unfortunately, pregnant women didn't always fare well in medieval times. They didn't have the same medical knowledge or care that we do now, so the chances of something going wrong during pregnancy or childbirth were much higher. Maternal mortality rates were shockingly high, with many women succumbing to complications during pregnancy or labor. Even minor issues, such as a baby being in the wrong position, could prove fatal. It's hard to believe that something as common as a breech or transverse presentation could lead to such dire consequences, but it did. The practice of surgery sections dates back to ancient times, and it was indeed performed during the medieval period. However, it was a last resort and carried significant risks. Most often, it was done as an emergency procedure when the mother was already near death, and sadly, many mothers did not survive the operation. In addition to the dangers faced by mothers, Infant mortality rates were also alarmingly high. If a newborn couldn't be breastfed, which was crucial for their survival, alternatives were limited. Wet nurses were sometimes employed, especially by noble families, but this option was not available to everyone. Animal milk, typically from cows or goats, was occasionally used, but it was far from ideal and often led to malnutrition and illness in infants. Surviving past childhood was a great achievement in medieval society. Making it to your first birthday was a significant milestone, and reaching 7 years old was a cause for celebration. This high infant mortality rate significantly reduced the average lifespan of the population, making it appear much lower than it was. Fortunately, advancements in modern medicine have drastically improved childbirth outcomes. Abdominal delivery sections are now much safer procedures, and medical interventions can effectively address complications during pregnancy and labor. Without these advancements, many mothers and babies, including myself, would not have survived childbirth. Number 8. Menstrual cycle. In medieval times, dealing with periods was very different than it is today. Even though we might feel uncomfortable talking about it openly, it's crucial to know how women handled their periods in the past. Instead of using modern sanitary pads, women would create their own from rags or whatever materials they could find. Since there were no underwear back then, they had to figure out how to keep these makeshift pads in place. Some women even used small green leaves that resembled tiny flowerless leafy stems, calling it blood moss, because it was good at absorbing liquids and was often used to treat wounds. Others, unable to find or make pads, would wear red clothes all the time to hide any stains. Resources for managing menstruation were very limited in those times. For those seeking an internal solution, a basic form of cotton wool was improvised. Women would wrap cotton fabric around a small branch or stick and insert it into their vagina. While this method may seem ancient and uncomfortable by today's standards, it was one of the few options available at the time. Interestingly, some women turned to nature for assistance. For those unable to create pads or tampons, the only option was to bleed freely or wear red clothing to hide any stains. This practice led to the association of menstruation with the color red in medieval art and literature. Although modern period products have greatly improved menstrual hygiene and comfort, it's important to acknowledge and appreciate the ingenuity of those who came before us. Dealing with periods might be tough now, but we have better ways to manage them than they did in medieval times. Number 7. The disturbing reality of witchcraft persecution. Back in medieval times, women faced a lot of unfair treatment and were often misunderstood. It's crazy to think that many people believed women were witches just because they were women. The idea was that women were somehow linked to Satan and were more likely to do bad things. It sounds pretty ridiculous now, but back then, people actually thought women were prone to sinning and practicing witchcraft. There were 3 main reasons why someone might accuse a woman of being a witch. Firstly, there was this idea that women were always craving physical pleasure, so they'd supposedly make deals with the devil to fulfill their desires. Secondly, women were seen as chatty and prone to telling lies, so they might use magic to get revenge or manipulate others. And finally, there was this belief that women were weak, so they'd resort to magic and spells to get their way. Accusations of witchcraft were rampant, and women were disproportionately targeted. Any deviation from expected behavior or societal norms could be interpreted as evidence of witchcraft. Even something as simple as an unconventional appearance or an independent spirit could land a woman in hot water. The criteria for diagnosing a woman as a witch became increasingly absurd and arbitrary over time. Women were accused of consorting with the devil for the most trivial reasons, such as having a pet cat or brewing herbal remedies. The fear of female power and autonomy drove these accusations, as women who displayed intelligence, assertiveness, or nonconformity were seen as a threat to the established order. Moreover, the witch hunt served as a convenient tool for social control, allowing authorities to suppress disagreement and maintain power. Accusations of witchcraft often arose in times of social upheaval or economic hardship, providing a scapegoat for societal woes. The persecution of women as witches had devastating consequences, resulting in imprisonment, torture, and execution on a massive scale. It is estimated that tens of thousands of women were killed during the witch hunts, with the majority of victims being women from excluded communities, such as the elderly, the poor, and the socially isolated. In reality, accusations of witchcraft were often used to target women who posed a threat to the clerical order or who challenged existing power structures. By demonizing and abusing women, society sought to maintain control over their bodies, minds, and actions. Ultimately, the persecution of women as witches was a manifestation of deeply ingrained shameful attitudes and the fear of female empowerment. It reflects a dark chapter in history when women's choices and agency were systematically suppressed in the name of religious intolerance and social control. Number 6. Accused and punishments for adultery. Accusations of adultery in the medieval era were not only grave, but also often resulted in drastic and life-altering consequences, particularly for women. The standards of evidence required to accuse a woman of adultery were shockingly biased, with mere whispers or hearsay being enough to condemn her. This glaring injustice is evident when considering the severity of the punishments handed out for an offense that was often ambiguously defined. The consequences of being accused of adultery were severe and could have long-lasting effects. Women who were suspected of cheating on their husbands were often publicly shamed and paraded through town squares while everyone knew about their supposed sins. In more extreme cases, women could be thrown into prison, where they faced even more suffering. This evil act served not only as physical damage, but also as a permanent mark of shame and degradation. Women were expected to uphold their family's honor at all costs, and any perceived wrongdoing was met with brutality. Meanwhile, men faced much less investigation and were rarely punished for similar offenses. This inequality reflected the deeply ingrained gender biases of the era. The severity of punishments for adultery reflected society's broad perspective on women's purity and fidelity. Women were expected to uphold their family's honor and reputation, and any perceived deviation from societal norms was met with harsh consequences. This disproportionate investigation and punishment of women compared to men underscored the deeply established gender discrimination of the time. Furthermore, this period was marked by a rigidly ranked and ancestral social structure, in which women were systematically marginalized and disempowered. Their actions were viewed through a merciless societal lens that placed them under constant surveillance and subjected them to harsh judgment. Despite the challenges they faced, women in the medieval era demonstrated remarkable resilience and fortitude in the face of adversity. The period was a challenging time for women, as they were constantly judged and punished for their actions. Society's harsh treatment of women during this time highlights the need to challenge the gender formula and fight for equality. Now, it's time for today's subscriber's pick. Once upon a time, in the heart of a medieval kingdom, there lived a young maiden named Isabel. She was the daughter of a humble farmer, destined to lead a simple life in the countryside. But fate had other plans for her. As she grew older, she became acutely aware of the injustices faced by women in her society. From an early age, she witnessed firsthand the mistreatment and oppression that women endured. They were expected to be obedient, silent, and submissive, their voices swallowed by the hard expectations of a dictatorial society. Her own mother had suffered greatly at the hands of her husband, enduring years of physical and emotional abuse. Despite her hardships, she had never spoken out against her husband, resigned to her fate as a dutiful wife. Determined to defy the norms of her time, she secretly began to educate herself, devouring books and seeking knowledge wherever she could find it. She longed for a world where women were treated as equals, where they could speak their minds and pursue their dreams without fear of punishment. But as she soon discovered, challenging the status quo came with grave consequences. Women who dared to defy societal norms were often branded as witches or adulteresses, subjected to cruel punishments like the scold's bridle or even worse. She watched in horror as her closest friend, Anna, was accused of witchcraft and sentenced to death by burning at the stake. Despite her innocence, Anna's cries fell on deaf ears, drowned out by the roar of the flames and the jeers of the crowd. Haunted by the injustice of her death, she vowed to fight for change, to break free from the chains of oppression that bound women in medieval society. But with each passing day, she faced new challenges and obstacles, and her courage was tested at every turn. How does Isabel's upbringing shape her views on women's rights in medieval society? What role do societal norms and expectations play in preserving the mistreatment of women in the story? What are your thoughts on this story we just showed you? Share your opinions in the comments below. Number 5. Bedding rituals. One of the most fascinating aspects of medieval customs was the practice of engagement rituals, especially during the later medieval ages. These ceremonies were deeply rooted in the belief that marriage was not just a social contract, but also a sacred union ordained by divine forces. In many cultures, including medieval England, the consummation of marriage was considered essential for its validity. This meant that the couple had to engage in intercourse to seal their union and fulfill their marital duties. However, the process leading up to this momentous event was often accompanied by elaborate rituals and traditions. One common practice was the blessing of the marriage bed by a priest. This ritual symbolized the sanctity of the union and invoked divine blessings upon the couple's future together. The presence of the priest served as a witness to the performance of the marriage and added a religious dimension to the engagement ceremony. In addition to the religious aspects, engagement rituals were also injected with cultural significance. In some communities, the bedding ceremony symbolized the transition of the bride from her family's household to her husband's, marking her acceptance into his family and social circle. Overall, engagement rituals in the medieval period were simplified events that combined religious, social, and cultural elements. They served not only to legalize the union between two individuals, but also to reinforce societal norms and values surrounding marriage and family life. After the wedding festivities came to a close, the newlyweds would retire to their private chamber to embark on the next phase of their celebration. This transition involved shedding their extravagant wedding garments and exchanging them for more comfortable underclothes, signifying the start of their intimate journey together. To further mark the occasion, the couple would indulge in a special drink, often a mixture of sweet and spicy wine meant to symbolize the sweetness and passion of their union. This ritualistic drink served as an opening to the main event, the fulfillment of their marriage. As the couple entered their chamber, they were surrounded by their closest friends and family members, who eagerly awaited the high point of the evening's festivities. The groomsmen and bridesmaids would take their places around the bed, forming a symbolic circle of support and encouragement for the newlyweds. In a lighthearted tradition, the groomsmen and bridesmaids would engage in a playful game by throwing the couple's stockings at them. It was believed that if a thrown stocking hit the newlyweds, the thrower would be the next in line to marry. This charming custom added an element of fun and anticipation to the proceedings. Once the stocking-throwing game had concluded, the curtains surrounding the bed would be drawn, providing the couple with a show of privacy for their intimate moment. However, in some cases, proof of the realization of the marriage was required, particularly if the marriage involved prominent figures or royalty. Interestingly, there were instances where individuals, particularly those of noble or royal status, refused to participate in this tradition. King Charles I of England famously resisted the pressure to perfect his marriage in front of witnesses, causing a stir among the attendants and society at large. For the bride, the prospect of fulfilling the marriage under the watchful eyes and ears of others must have been discouraging. Even under normal circumstances, the first intimate encounter between couples can be filled with nervousness and anticipation. However, in this situation, with a room full of people on the other side of a curtain, the pressure would have been noticeable for both the bride and groom. Number 4. Getting married young. Marriage is a breakthrough that people reach at different stages of life. Some choose to tie the knot shortly after finishing high school, while others wait until later in life to say, "I do." However, during the Middle Ages, the practice of getting married at a young age was quite common, especially for girls. In medieval times, it was not unusual for girls to be married off as soon as they reached puberty, which could be as young as 12 years old. At this age, girls were considered to be mature enough to take on the responsibilities of marriage and motherhood. However, it was often their parents who made the decision about whom they would marry, leaving the girls with little say in the matter. For many young girls, this meant being forced into adulthood before they had the chance to fully experience childhood. They were expected to take on the roles of wife and mother without having had the opportunity to explore their own interests or pursue their own dreams. This lack of autonomy and agency could have long-lasting consequences for their personal development and well-being. While marriage at a young age was considered normal in medieval society, it is important to recognize the impact it had on the lives of young girls. It deprived them of the chance to make their own choices and shape their own destinies, instead subjecting them to the expectations and decisions of others. These young girls have hopes and dreams. They want to accomplish things and become someone important. It's hard to understand the amount of stress and responsibility they must face at such a tender age. But what's even more troubling is how these young brides were treated by their husbands. According to the laws of the time, husbands had the legal right to physically discipline their wives to a certain extent. This meant that a husband could hurt his wife without facing any legal consequences. Additionally, husbands were expected to act as authority figures, teaching their wives manners and instilling politeness in them. This custom often left wives feeling oppressed and powerless in their marriages. Despite these challenges, many women found the courage to leave their husbands if they were unhappy in their marriages. However, attempting to escape a marriage could have dire consequences. In some cases, women who tried to leave their husbands could be accused of witchcraft, a serious crime in the Middle Ages. If caught, these women faced the terrifying prospect of being burned at the stake as punishment for their disobedience. Number 3. Limited legal rights. During the Middle Ages, women were captured in a complex web of legal embarrassment that severely restricted their autonomy and rights. In clear contrast to their male counterparts, who enjoyed a great deal of freedom, women faced significant barriers in making decisions that affected their lives. One striking limitation was that most women lacked the ability to independently handle legal matters, such as signing contracts or borrowing money. Instead, they were required to obtain permission from a male guardian, typically their father or husband. These male guardians held considerable power over women's destinies, controlling not only their financial affairs, but also crucial decisions related to marriage and property ownership. For women living in this era, their voices were often muted and excluded, with societal rules and legal systems reinforcing their subordinate status. The clerical structure of medieval society dictated that women were expected to adapt to male authority figures in all aspects of their lives, further diminishing their agency and autonomy. The legal constraints faced by women during the Middle Ages had profound implications for their social and economic well-being. Without the ability to assert their rights and make decisions independently, women were often relegated to subordinate roles and denied opportunities for self-determination. It was a challenging and oppressive time for women, marked by systemic inequality and gender-based discrimination. However, history reveals that there were notable exceptions to this pattern. Some women, particularly those from noble or wealthy families, managed to wield significant influence behind the scenes, despite the societal norms that sought to limit their power. These exceptional women often used their wealth, social connections, and intelligence to navigate the clerical restrictions of their time. They strategically formed alliances, brokered deals, and even engaged in political maneuvering to advance their own interests and those of their families. In some cases, these women effectively acted as the actual heads of their households, exerting authority over matters ranging from financial management to estate administration. One famous example of such a powerful woman was Eleanor of Aquitaine, who wielded considerable political influence as both the Queen of France and later the Queen of England. Despite the prevailing gender norms, Eleanor played a crucial role in shaping the political landscape of medieval Europe, participating actively in matters of governance and diplomacy. However, it is important to note that these instances of female empowerment were the exception rather than the rule. For the majority of women in their society, legal rights and autonomy remained difficult dreams, denied to them solely because of their gender. Number 2. ladies of the night. In the shadows of the night, individuals often resorted to unconventional methods to earn money. Just as we have side hustles and low-paying jobs to cover expenses today, people in medieval times also sought various means to make ends meet. During the Middle Ages, economic opportunities were limited, especially for women who were often excluded from formal employment. As a result, many women had to rely on their own ingenuity and resourcefulness to support themselves and their families. In a society where social mobility was restricted and financial independence was difficult, women often turned to utilize their skills, talents, and even physical attributes to generate income. Some engaged in activities such as spinning wool, selling homemade goods, or providing services as midwives or healers. However, for those who lacked other options, resorting to more irregular means of earning money was not uncommon. This could include activities such as fortune-telling, begging, or even engaging in illicit trades. While these endeavors may have been frowned upon by society, they provided a means of survival for many women who found themselves marginalized and economically disadvantaged. Despite facing numerous obstacles, these women demonstrated resilience and resourcefulness in their efforts to navigate the economic challenges of medieval life. Unlike in later eras when prostitution became criminalized, in that period, it was widely accepted as a common and established occupation, relating to other trades like baking or blacksmithing. Women who engaged in prostitution were viewed as entrepreneurs, effectively operating their own businesses by selling their services to clients. This unique perspective treated their bodies as commodities to be traded, reflecting the commercial mindset of the time. Additionally, the profession of prostitution was often regulated and taxed by local authorities, further legitimizing its status as a recognized trade. The widespread presence of prostitution was such that nearly every town in medieval Europe boasted its own warehouse, catering to the diverse needs of the people. Even in smaller communities, warehouses could be found, serving as the home of social interaction and commerce. Despite the moral and religious objections to it remained an integral part of society, reflecting the complexities of human behavior and societal attitudes toward sex and commerce. The existence of warehouses and the acceptance of as a profession shed light on the economic realities and social dynamics of their life. It underscores the importance of understanding historical contexts and the diverse ways in which individuals navigated the complexities of survival and livelihood in different eras. Number 1. Metal spikes in mouths. In the medieval era, women faced a multitude of harsh punishments, but one of the most notorious was the scold's bridle. This cruel device, also known as a branks or gossip's bridle, was used to silence women who were perceived as being too outspoken or disobedient. The scold's bridle typically consisted of an iron framework that enclosed the head, with a metal bit or tongue plate inserted into the woman's mouth. This bit often had sharp metal pins or blades pointing inward, designed to pierce the tongue or cheeks if the wearer attempted to speak. The use of the scold's bridle was not limited to any specific region and was employed throughout Europe during the Middle Ages and beyond. It was often used as a form of public humiliation and punishment, with women being paraded through the streets while wearing the device. In addition to its physical pain, the scold's bridle inflicted significant psychological trauma on its victims. The humiliation of being publicly silenced and self-control served as a warning to other women to conform to societal expectations of behavior and obedience. Despite its widespread use, it eventually fell out of favor as a view towards punishment and women's rights development. The origins of the scold's bridle can be traced back to the early modern period in Europe, with documented instances dating as far back as the 16th century. It was primarily used in England and Scotland, although variations of similar devices existed in other European countries. The design varied, but its purpose remained consistent: to punish and control women who were perceived as being too outspoken or disobedient. In addition to the metal spikes inside the mouth, some versions of the bridle also featured other forms of torture, such as locking mechanisms or chains to restrict movement. The public humiliation inflicted by the scold's bridle was not limited to urban areas. In rural communities, women wearing the device would often be paraded through the countryside, subjected to jeers and insults from onlookers. This widespread public shaming served as a powerful discouragement against abnormal behavior and reinforced societal norms of female submission and obedience. Despite its widespread use, the scold's bridle eventually fell out of favor as attitudes towards punishment and women's rights evolved. In the 18th and 19th centuries, it was gradually replaced by other forms of punishment, and by the early 20th century, its use had largely ceased. Today, examples of the scold's bridle can be found in museums and historical collections, serving as reminders of the brutal treatment endured by women in the past. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.